Get your hands off me! Julia Kendrick's voice cracked like a whip through the gray Texas dawn, and Thomas Brighton heard it before he saw anything. He pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of town. A woman stood in the road, bag clutched to her chest, blood drying on her lip, eyes wild with something that wasn't panic, it was calculation. She was figuring her odds. Behind her, a man on horseback raised his fist again. Thomas didn't think. He just moved. If this story already has your heart beating faster, subscribe to our channel, follow this journey all the way to California, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Thomas Brighton had been awake since before the sun thought about rising. That was nothing new. Cowboys didn't sleep so much as pause a few hours of horizontal darkness between one hard day and the next. But this morning felt different in his bones. He'd rolled up his bedroll in the empty bunkhouse for the last time, run his hand along the wall once like he was saying goodbye to a living thing, and walked out without looking back. The Danner Ranch was gone. Not burned, not flooded, not lost to drought, sold. Old Gerald Danner had died in February without a will that held together under legal scrutiny, and his nephew, a man who'd never roped a calf or fixed a fence post in his life, had arrived from Chicago with a buyer already lined up and a handshake for all the hands that translated directly to, "You've got 2 weeks." Thomas had been at that ranch for 6 years. He knew every acre of it, every temperamental water trough, every spot where the fence went soft in spring. He'd poured himself into that land, the way some men pour themselves into whiskey or church completely, and without much left over for anything else. And now he had $73 a horse named Copper, a rifle, a bedroll, a canvas saddlebag with 4 days of provisions, and a piece of paper with a name on it, Elias Foran. Sacramento, California. Elias was his mother's brother, a man Thomas had met exactly twice, both times at funerals. But word had come through a mutual acquaintance that Elias was getting old, that he had land near Sacramento. He couldn't work anymore, and that he was looking for someone with a strong back and a solid reputation to either buy him out on installment or partner with him outright. It wasn't much. It wasn't even a promise. But Thomas Brighton was 32 years old, and he'd learned something in those years. A thin thread of hope was still a thread, and sometimes that was enough to pull yourself forward by. He mounted Copper at the edge of Dalton, Texas, just as the town's single rooster decided the world needed to know it was Tuesday. The sky was charcoal going gray, going faintly orange at one edge, and the road west stretched out in front of him like a sentence that hadn't been finished yet. He'd been riding maybe 40 minutes when he heard her voice. "Get your hands off me!" The words hit the air sharp and clean, and Thomas's hand went to his rifle before his mind had fully registered what he was hearing. Copper tensed beneath him. The horse had good instincts, better than most people Thomas had known. He crested a low rise in the road and saw them. A woman stood in the dirt about 30 yards ahead. She was young, mid-20s. He'd guessed dressed in a traveling coat that had been expensive once, but had a tear along the left shoulder and dust ground deep into the hem. She was holding a canvas bag against her chest, like it was the only thing in the world she still owned. Her lip was split. There was a bruise rising high on her cheekbone that hadn't fully declared itself yet, but would be ugly by noon. The man on horseback above her was broad, red-faced, with the particular kind of anger that lives in a man permanently not sparked by anything specific, just always there, looking for a direction. "You don't get to walk away from family business," the man said, and he had a voice like gravel being dragged across wood. "Samuel is your husband. That piece of paper your lawyer filed doesn't mean a damn thing out here, and you know it. It means everything," the woman said, and her voice was steady. That surprised Thomas. Her hands were shaking, he could see it from here, but her voice was steady. "It's legal. It's done. And if you put your hands on me again, I will—" "You'll what?" The man laughed, and it wasn't a good laugh. "You got nobody, Julia. You got nothing. Samuel told me to bring you back, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." Thomas made a decision. He walked Copper forward at a normal pace. Nothing aggressive. Nothing that announced itself. He kept his hands visible and his expression entirely neutral, the face of a man who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything. "Morning," he said, directing it at no one in particular. The red-faced man turned. His hand moved toward his belt, then stopped when he clocked the rifle across Thomas's saddle, and the way Thomas's hand rested near it with the easy familiarity of someone who'd used it before. "This is a private matter," the man said. "That's so." Thomas stopped Copper a few yards off and looked at the woman. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not hope exactly, but something adjacent to it, held down tight, like she didn't want to feel it before she knew if it was warranted. "Are you all right, ma'am?" "She's fine," the man said. "I wasn't asking you." Thomas kept his eyes on the woman. She held his gaze for a moment. Then quietly, "No, I'm not all right." The red-faced man made a sound low in his throat and shifted in his saddle. "You need to ride on, mister. I'm not going to say it twice." "I appreciate that," Thomas said. "Here's my question, though. The lady's lip is bleeding and you've got your hand on your belt, and she doesn't appear to want to go anywhere with you. Now, I'm going to ask her one more time, and I want you to let her answer without interrupting." The man's jaw tightened. "Do you have any idea who—" "Ma'am?" Thomas ignored him entirely. "Do you want to go with this man?" The woman lifted her chin. "No." "Do you need a ride somewhere?" She hesitated only a second, but he saw it. She was calculating again, same as before. Looking at him, weighing him, deciding something. "I need to leave Texas," she said finally. "I need to go as far west as I can." Thomas glanced at the man on horseback, whose face had gone the color of a sunset that wasn't going to end well. "I'm heading to California," Thomas said. He looked back at the woman. "Get in. I'll take you as far as you need." The red-faced man's name, as Julia explained it, once they were moving. Copper, walking steady, her bag wedged between her knees, was Richard Kendrick, her former brother-in-law. Former, she said the word like she was practicing keeping something true by repetition. She'd ridden behind Thomas without comment for the first mile, and then without his asking, she'd started to talk. He figured she'd been holding it a long time, and the relief of forward motion had finally loosened something. "His brother Samuel is my husband," she said. "Legally he was. He isn't anymore. The divorce was finalized in March. Judge Orton in Waco signed it. It's registered. It's real." "But Samuel doesn't accept it," Thomas said. "Samuel doesn't accept anything he didn't decide." She said it without emotion, the way you describe the weather, not because you don't care, but because you've already used up all your feeling about it, and what's left is just the fact. "He's been sending Richard after me since April. This is the third time." "What happened the first two—" A pause. "I got away," she said simply. Thomas glanced back at her over his shoulder. She was watching the horizon behind them, and there was nothing soft about the way she did it. She wasn't looking for comfort in that direction. She was looking for dust, the kind that meant riders following at pace. "You're going to want to watch our back trail," she said. "Already am," Thomas said. A few minutes passed in silence. The kind of silence that isn't uncomfortable so much as necessary. Two people on either side of a decision, letting it settle. "I don't expect anything from you," Julia said. "I want you to know that. A ride is a ride. I can work. I can cook. I know how to handle provisions. I can read a map, and I can shoot if I need to." She paused. "I'll pull my weight. I'm not asking to be carried." Thomas turned that over for a moment. "What's your name?" he asked. Julia Kendrick." She said the last name like it cost her something. "Thomas Brighton." He reached his hand back over his shoulder, and she shook it briefly and businesslike, the way a person does when they're sealing something that matters. "I'm headed to Sacramento. You can come as far as you need and go your own direction whenever you're ready. No obligation." "Sacramento," she repeated quietly, like she was placing it on a map in her mind. That's about as far from here as you can get." "That's the idea," Thomas said. "Yeah, They made 12 miles before the first real problem. The problem, or more accurately, the lack of it at the place there should have been some. There was a creek marked on Thomas's hand-drawn map. He'd gotten the route details from a man in Dalton who'd made the journey twice. And when they got to where the creek should have been, there was nothing but a dry cut in the earth and some cracked mud with wishful thinking on it. Thomas got down and examined it, knelt in the dust, and looked at the bed. "Recent," he said. "Dried up inside the last 3 weeks." "How far to the next water?" Julia asked. She'd gotten down too, and she was checking Copper's left rear leg. The horse had started going fractionally uneven about a mile back, and she'd noticed it before Thomas had. "He picked something up," she said, finding a small stone wedged at the inner edge of the shoe. She had it out in under a minute, working efficiently and without making a production of it. Thomas watched her do it. He didn't say anything. "Next water on your map," she prompted. 8 miles, maybe 9. He stood. "We'll have to ration what I've got in the canteens." He paused. "I've got enough for 2 people if we're careful." She looked at him, and there was something in that look, a kind of inventory, taking his measure for the second time since they'd met, recalibrating against new data. "We'll be careful," she said. By mid-afternoon they'd made another 9 miles, found the creek, this one still running, barely watered Copper, and refilled the canteens, and stopped in the shade of a limestone outcropping to eat and rest during the worst of the heat. Thomas had salt pork and hardtack, and some dried apricots he'd packed as a luxury. Julia had in her bag a small wheel of hard cheese and a pouch of coffee and a handful of biscuits, wrapped in cloth that were only slightly stale. They combined resources without discussing it, which said something Thomas didn't put a name to. "How long have you been running?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. She was chewing, looking at the middle distance. "Since January," she said at last. "That's when I left the house. The divorce took until March. I've been staying with friends, then acquaintances, then strangers who were kind enough to answer a knock on their door." She paused. "You can't stay in one place when someone is looking for you. You stay too long, and they find someone who'll talk." "Where are you trying to get to? California's a big territory." "San Francisco," she said. "I have a cousin there, Miriam. She's been writing to me for 2 years trying to get me to come out. I never could before." Her jaw tightened slightly. "Samuel controlled who I wrote to, who I received letters from, the money, everything. I had a dress and a name and a role to perform, and I performed it until I couldn't anymore." She stopped. "I'm not asking for your pity." "I know you're not," Thomas said. "People get that look," she said flatly. "Like I must have been weak to let it happen. Like I should have left earlier. Like there's some clear moment where the sensible thing to be done was obvious, and I just didn't do it." "People who say things like that have never been trapped," Thomas said. "I don't know what your marriage was like. I know I've seen men treat horses the way you're describing being treated, and it doesn't say anything about the horse." She was quiet for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "What did you expect? Someone who'd drop me off at the first town and feel good about himself for helping?" She looked at him with those same calculating eyes, but there was something else in there now, something cautious and unwilling to name itself. "You still might." "I might," Thomas allowed, "but probably not." They were back on the road by mid-afternoon, making decent time when Thomas heard it. He heard it before he saw anything, just a shift in the quality of the air, a distant sound that could have been anything and was probably something. "How many men does Richard typically travel with?" he asked. Julia straightened immediately behind him. 2, sometimes 3. Thomas glanced at the road behind them. Dust, maybe 2 miles back, moving at a pace that suggested intention. "We've got company," he said. Julia turned and looked, and the calculation on her face solidified into something harder and colder. "That's Richard. He went to get the others." She paused. "He'll have Samuel with him." "Samuel's out here himself." Samuel wouldn't send anyone to do something he could do personally, she said grimly. It's a point of pride. Thomas thought fast. He didn't run. That was his first decision. You didn't run from mounted men on open ground if you could avoid it, because the psychology of a chase told every party involved exactly who had power and who didn't. He looked at the terrain, saw a narrow split between two rocky rises about a quarter-mile ahead, and made his decision. I know that gap up there, he said. What are we doing? Not running. He glanced back at her. Can you actually shoot? You said you could. She reached into her bag without a word and produced a small revolver, a .38 clean and competently maintained. Samuel taught me, she said. It was the most useful thing he ever did for me. Thomas felt something that might have been the beginning of a smile. All right, here's what we're going to do. The confrontation at the gap between the rocks was not a gunfight. Thomas had positioned them carefully. Copper out of sight, Julia behind a boulder with the revolver himself visible, but in a position where a shot at him would be difficult, and a shot from him would not. He'd lived long enough in rough country to know that most confrontations didn't come down to who was faster or who had more men. They came down to who made the first mistake. Richard Kendrick rode up with two other men and stopped short when he saw Thomas standing in the road, rifle unhurried in his hands. Where is she? Richard said. I don't know what you're talking about, Thomas said pleasantly. Don't play me. Richard's eyes were scanning the rocks. Julia Kendrick is a married woman and... Divorced woman, came Julia's voice clear and steady from somewhere above and to Richard's left. He startled. The paperwork is registered in Waco, Richard. You know it is. Richard's jaw worked. His two companions were looking at each other with the calculation of men who were getting paid, not the commitment of men who had a cause to die for. Samuel is right behind us, Richard said, directing it at the rocks. You know what he's going to do when he gets here, Julia. Don't make this harder. Here's what I want you to do, Thomas said, drawing Richard's attention back forward. His voice was completely even. I want you to turn your horses around. I want you to ride back the way you came. And I want you to tell Samuel Kendrick that his ex-wife is none of his business anymore, and that the next man who follows her is going to have a harder conversation than this one. Richard laughed short and ugly. You don't know who you're dealing with. I'm dealing with a man who put his hands on a woman this morning and called it family business, Thomas said. I'm not impressed by whatever else comes after that. The silence stretched. Then one of the two hired men said quietly but audibly to the other, I didn't sign up to get shot. Richard shot him a furious look. But the damage was done. The calculation on both men's faces had completed its work, and they were already shifting their horses slightly back. This isn't over, Richard said. I know, Thomas said. I'll be here. Richard held the position for one more long moment, trying to salvage something out of the confrontation. Thomas understood, because men like Richard needed to leave with a piece of dignity intact, or they became even more dangerous. Thomas gave him the moment. Didn't push. Then Richard turned his horse, and the other two followed, and the sound of their hooves faded back east. Thomas waited until they were genuinely gone before he lowered the rifle. Julia came down from behind the boulder. She had the revolver still in her hand, unhurried the way someone holds a tool after finishing a job. She stopped a few feet from him. You didn't flinch, she said. Neither did you. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he still couldn't fully read, but it had changed again, that expression. Something had shifted in the architecture of it. Richard said Samuel is close behind, she said. I heard. He meant it. Samuel doesn't bluff. She paused. We need to move fast, and we need to stop making a predictable track. Agreed, Thomas said. He went to get Copper. Welcome to the part of the journey that gets harder. Was there an easier part? She asked. He thought about that. No, he admitted. Not really. And they rode west as the afternoon turned golden and long, and the dust behind them was quiet for now, and California was still impossibly far away, and Thomas Brighton, who had left Texas alone with a piece of paper and a half-formed plan and $73, had somewhere in the last 12 hours acquired a partner he hadn't asked for, and was begged he wouldn't know how to ride without. He didn't examine that thought too closely. The road was ahead of them, and ahead was the only direction that mattered. They rode until the light gave out. Not because Thomas wanted to stop. He would have pushed another 2 hours if the decision had been his alone. But Copper had been working hard since before dawn, and a horse with a tired leg on rough ground in the dark was a horse that could put both of them on foot in the middle of nowhere. Thomas knew better than to let pride make that call. He found a shallow depression off the main road, sheltered enough to kill the silhouette of a campfire, if they kept it small. Julia was already off Copper before he finished dismounting, and she was untying the saddlebag with the efficiency of someone who'd made camp before, under circumstances that didn't allow for hesitation. "I'll take first watch," she said. "You haven't slept. Neither have you." She looked at him directly. "And I sleep lighter than you do." "I don't know that yet for a fact, but I'd bet on it." Thomas thought about arguing. He decided against it. She wasn't wrong. She'd been running for months, and people who ran like that learned to sleep with one ear open, or they didn't keep running long. "Wake me in 3 hours," he said. "I'll wake you when something needs waking for," she said, which wasn't quite an agreement, but was close enough that he let it go. He was asleep before the fire had settled into coals. He woke to her hand on his arm, not urgent but firm, and he was sitting up with his hand on the rifle before he was fully conscious. "Easy," she said quietly. "Nothing moving. I heard something about an hour ago, and it turned out to be nothing, but I couldn't get back to a comfortable read on things after that." Thomas sat still for a moment and listened to the dark. The night had that particular quality of genuine quiet, not the false quiet of something holding its breath, but the honest quiet of nothing happening. "How long was I out?" he asked. 4 hours, maybe a little more." She paused. "You needed it." He looked at her. She was sitting with her back against a rock, the revolver in her lap, a composure about her that seemed less like calm and more like someone who'd found the floor of their fear a long time ago and learned to stand on it. "You should have woken me at 3, he said. "You were useful asleep. You're useful awake. I was making a practical decision." She handed him the canteen. "Drink something." He drank, handed it back. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It had the quality of two people who'd already passed through the awkward phase and come out somewhere more honest on the other side. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said. "You can ask." "When you left Samuel the first time in January, how did you do it?" She was quiet for a moment. Not like she was deciding whether to answer. More like she was deciding where to start. "He went to Abilene for 3 days for a cattle deal," she said. "He always took Richard with him on business. When they left, I had 4 hours before the housekeeper arrived. I packed one bag, just one, because 2 would slow me down, and I knew it. I took the money I'd hidden over 8 months. Small amounts at a time from the household account. Nothing he'd notice in a single week, but enough to matter when it was together." She paused. "I took my mother's ring. I left everything else. You planned it for 8 months. "I planned it the day after our first anniversary," she said flatly. "It just took me 2 more years to have enough money and enough courage at the same time." Thomas processed that. The weight of it, 2 years of living in something terrible while quietly, carefully, invisibly building a way out of it. That wasn't weakness. That was the kind of patience that cost more than most people spent in a lifetime. "The divorce lawyer," he said. "How did you manage that if Samuel controlled the money?" "My cousin Miriam sent funds from San Francisco. We wrote in a code we'd made up as girls talked about recipes. Flower gardens, nothing that would raise questions if someone read the letters." A ghost of something crossed her face, something that might have been pride in her younger self. "Samuel never thought I was smart enough to be dangerous. That was his biggest mistake." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "He underestimated you," he said. "Most people do," she said without bitterness. "Just fact. I used to mind it. Now I just use it." They broke camp before sunrise and were moving by the time the sky went from black to gray. The road west unrolled in front of them, through country that was getting drier and more spare, and Thomas kept his eyes moving behind them, ahead the rises on either side. By mid-morning, they'd made 8 miles and had encountered nothing more threatening than a rattlesnake that Copper sidestepped with practiced contempt. "Tell me about California," Julia said. They'd been riding in companionable quiet for almost an hour, and she broke it the way people do when they've been thinking about something and finally decide speaking it is better than carrying it. "What do you want to know?" "What are you going to do there, specifically?" Thomas shifted in the saddle. "My mother's brother has a ranch outside Sacramento, about 200 acres from what I was told. He's too old to work it himself anymore, and he's got no sons. He said he was willing to sell on installment to the right person or partner outright if the terms made sense." "And you've met him twice?" "At funerals." She absorbed that. "So your entire plan is based on a 2-sentence message passed through a mutual acquaintance and 2 gravesite conversations. When you say it like that, it sounds worse than it is." "Does it?" He thought about it. "No," he admitted. "It's probably as uncertain as it sounds. But it's something real to ride toward, and right now, that's worth more to me than nothing certain anywhere." She was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," she said finally, and she meant it. He could hear the weight of personal recognition in it. "What about your restaurant?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had shifted. It had something softer in it, but not weak. More like a thing that was precious and had been protected carefully. "My grandmother ran a boarding house in Virginia," she said. "She cooked everything herself. I grew up in that kitchen. I know how to feed 50 people at once without losing quality. I know how to manage supplies. I know how to keep a kitchen running on a budget that would make most cooks cry." She paused. "I know what people need when they're far from home and tired and want something that tastes like someone cared about them. I know how to give them that." Thomas said nothing. He let the words sit in the air. "Samuel thought it was a ridiculous fantasy," she said. "He said women who wanted to run businesses were embarrassing themselves." "Samuel," Thomas said carefully, "appears to have been wrong about most things." Something shifted in her, a small, involuntary thing, almost a breath of a laugh that she caught and swallowed, but it had been there. The first real trouble came at noon. They'd stopped at a trading post, little more than a weathered building with a hand-painted sign and a water trough outside to refill the canteens and check whether Thomas could trade for more provisions. There was a man sitting outside on a barrel who looked them over with the deliberate, unhurried attention of someone who made it his business to notice who came and went. Thomas went in and handled the trade 2 of his silver dollars for a good amount of dried beans, a sack of cornmeal, and a piece of salt beef. He was back outside in under 10 minutes. The man on the barrel said without preamble, "You two heading west?" "Generally," Thomas said. "Road ahead's being watched." The man said it in the same tone he'd say the weather was changing. Matter of fact, no particular stake in it. "There's a fella been asking about a woman on the road, matching a description that'd fit your companion there pretty well." He glanced at Julia with no expression. "Offering money for information." Thomas kept his face still. "Is that right?" "I'm telling you because I don't take money for pointing out a woman who's running from trouble," the man said. "I got daughters." He looked at Thomas steadily. "Whoever's asking is 2 hours behind you at the pace you're going, and they're not coming alone this time." Julia's hand found the revolver under her coat. Thomas saw it and didn't comment. "How many?" Thomas asked. "4 riders. One of them is the man doing the asking. Got money and means and a face that thinks it's owed something." The man spat into the dirt. "The other 3 are hired. Different type professionals, not family men looking for a fee." Thomas looked at Julia. Her face was controlled, but her jaw had that particular set to it, the one he was starting to recognize as her holding something steady by will alone. "Samuel," she said. "Samuel," he confirmed. He looked back at the man on the barrel. "Is there another route west that avoids the main road for the next 20 miles?" The man considered. Then he nodded slowly and described it a track that cut north first and then looped west longer by half a day's ride, but off any road Samuel's men would logically watch. "You," Thomas said. "Don't thank me," the man said. "Just keep going." They took the northern track. It was harder ground, rougher, less defined, the kind of route that asked more of a horse and more of the people on it. But it was quiet. No dust behind them. No sound of riders. They rode hard for 3 hours before Thomas let himself breathe normally again. "He hired professionals," Julia said. She'd been processing it since the trading post. He could tell working through it methodically the way she did everything. "That changes things," Thomas said. "It changes everything." She was quiet for a moment. "Samuel hired professionals once before, when I first filed for divorce. He hired a man who specialized in having people declared mentally incompetent, had him write a document claiming I was unstable, delusional, a danger to myself." Her voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone cold. "It went before a magistrate in Waco. My lawyer barely stopped it. Another week and I would have been committed to an asylum, and the divorce would have been nullified because a committed woman can't bring legal proceedings." Thomas's hands tightened on the reins. "He tried to have you declared insane," he said. "He tried to have me erased," she said. "Institutionalized, legally incapacitated, removed from the world and put somewhere I couldn't fight back from. If my lawyer hadn't found a counter-witness in time..." She stopped, started again. "The judge ruled in my favor by 1 vote on the panel. 1. Thomas rode in silence for a moment. "The professionals he's hired now," he said. "What do you think they're for?" "To take me back," she said. "Not gently, not legally. Just take me." She paused. "Or to remove the problem. I don't know which, and I'm not sure Samuel does either yet." The words hung in the air between them. Thomas didn't dress it up. He didn't offer reassurance that would have been empty. He said, "Then we have to make sure neither of those things happens." "How?" she asked. "We don't stop being careful, and we don't stop moving," he said. "And we stop traveling like we're strangers, sharing a road." She looked at him. He could feel it even without turning around. "What are we traveling like instead?" she asked. "Like 2 people who are actually watching out for each other," he said. "Which is what we're doing anyway. Might as well be deliberate about it." Another pause. "That's not the worst idea you've had," she said. They found Diego Martinez at the edge of his property as the afternoon was going long and golden and the ground had started to level out. He was a man of maybe 55, compact, and weathered with the eyes of someone who'd seen enough of the world to have calibrated opinions on most of it. He was fixing a section of fence alone, and he looked up at them without alarm. Thomas explained the situation plainly, not everything but enough. They needed to camp off a visible route. There were men following them for reasons that were, he said carefully, entirely on the wrong side of legal and decent. Diego Martinez listened without interrupting. Then he said, "My wife makes dinner in 1 hour. You will eat first and talk more after." Julia made a small sound behind Thomas, not quite surprise, but adjacent to it. "We don't want to bring trouble to your door," she said. Diego looked at her with steady, direct eyes. "Trouble comes to my door, or it doesn't ask my permission either way. But hungry people at my table, I can do something about." He nodded toward the property. "Come." Maria Martinez was a woman who communicated primarily through food and efficient observation. She looked at Julia once when they arrived, took in the split lip and the bruise, and the way Julia held herself, not broken, not soft, not asking for anything, and set a cup of coffee in front of her without comment. Julia wrapped both hands around it and something in her shoulders came down, Thomas noticed. He was across the table from her, and he noticed the exact moment she let herself be somewhere safe for the first time in God knew how long. Her eyes didn't change. She was still alert, still watching the door, but something in the architecture of her body had granted itself a temporary reprieve. Diego sat across from Thomas while Maria moved around them, and he said quietly, "The man following her. How serious?" "He hired professionals," Thomas said. Diego nodded slowly. The gravity of it registered on his face. "How far behind?" "We bought ourselves a half day with the northern track, maybe more." Thomas paused. "I don't want them to know we stopped here. They won't learn it from this house," Diego said simply. "I have had people shelter here before. The road is hard, and not everyone on it is running toward trouble. Some are running away from things they should not have to run from." He looked at Thomas carefully. "The woman. She is strong." "She's the strongest person I've met in a long time," Thomas said, and it came out without him weighing it first. Diego looked at him with a small expression that said several things without saying any of them. "Eat," was what he said instead. After dinner, after the plates were cleared, and Maria had pressed food for the road on them in a way that didn't admit the possibility of refusal, Thomas and Julia sat outside in the cooling air while Diego checked on the horses. It was the first time they'd been still without the requirement of watchfulness pressing down on them. Temporarily, provisionally still. Julia said, "You said today that we needed to stop traveling like strangers." "I did." "We are strangers," she said. "You know that." "Less than we were this morning," he said. She looked at the sky. There were stars coming up, the early ones pale at the edge of the dark. "I don't trust easily," she said. "I want you to know that. It's not about you specifically. It's just that I trusted someone completely once, and he used it to take everything from me that I didn't nail down. You learn from that." "You should learn from that," Thomas said. She turned to look at him. "Most people argue with it. Tell me I can't let one bad experience color everything." "Most people haven't had your experience," he said. "Trust should be earned. That's not damage. That's good sense." The silence between them was different now. Not the silence of two people who don't know each other. The silence of two people who are beginning to carefully with their eyes open. "Thomas," she said. "Yeah. If it comes to a fight, a real one, I need you to not treat me like something that needs to be kept behind you." She held his gaze. "I've been put behind things my whole life. Behind closed doors, behind Samuel's reputation, behind other people's versions of who I was supposed to be. I won't do it again." He looked back at her steadily. "I don't put useful people behind me," he said. "I put them exactly where they're most effective." Something in her face unlocked just slightly, just at the edges. "That," she said quietly, "is the right answer." They were on the road again before first light. Diego had given them something else besides food and shelter. He'd given them a contact in New Mexico, a man in a town called Mesilla, who ran a legitimate freight operation and was, Diego said, with a careful emphasis, someone who knew how to be discreet about who had traveled through. "He will help you resupply," Diego said at the door, pressing a small folded note into Thomas's hand. "Tell him Diego sent you. That is enough." "We'll repay you," Thomas said. "You will pay it forward," Diego said. "That is the same thing." He looked at Julia. "You are going to reach California," he said. Not like a comfort, like a statement of observable fact. Julia held his gaze for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I am." They rode out as the dark was just beginning to thin, and the road ahead curved west through country that didn't care about their troubles and wouldn't make it easier and wouldn't make it harder. Just the land, just the miles, just the long, unglamorous work of going forward. Thomas checked the back trail. Clean, nothing moving. For now. He'd been riding alone 6 weeks ago in his mind, making his solitary plans. The ranch sold the future, blank the road to California, a private project he hadn't thought to share with anyone. He looked at the road ahead. Whatever that plan had been, it was different now. He wasn't sure if he was honest that it was worse. He didn't examine that thought too closely either. The road went west, and they went with it, and behind them, the quiet held for one more morning, and that was enough. The quiet didn't last. It held for 2 days. 2 days of hard riding of dry camps and rationed water, and the particular exhaustion that comes not just from physical effort, but from sustained alertness, fully letting your guard down, even when you sleep. 2 days of learning each other in the way that travel teaches people, which is faster and more honest than almost any other method. You find out who someone is when they're hungry and tired and scared and still have to make decisions. You find out what they're made of when the comfortable options are gone. Thomas found out that Julia did not complain. Not once. Not when the water ran short. Not when the ground was too hard to sleep on. Not when the provisions were monotonous and the weather turned mean. She adapted. She problem-solved. She took what was available and made it functional, and she did it without performing toughness. She was just tough quietly and without announcement. The way people are tough when it's been required of them long enough that it stopped being a choice and became a characteristic. Julia found out that Thomas thought before he spoke. That he watched things people terrain situations with a patience that wasn't. Passivity was the opposite of passivity, was actually a very active and deliberate gathering of information before committing to a course. She'd lived with a man who reacted to everything instantly and loudly and with his hands, and the contrast was so stark, it sometimes made her sit with it quietly and turn it over like an object she hadn't seen the shape of before. On the evening of the second day out from Diego's property, she said, "You went very still when that rider passed us on the road this morning." "He was looking at us the wrong way," Thomas said. "I noticed that too. How long have you been reading people like that?" "Long enough." He paused. "My father had a temper. You learn young to read a room when the alternative is not reading it." She looked at him. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was useful." He said it the same way she'd talked about Samuel teaching her to shoot, extracting the only valuable thing from a bad situation and using it forward. She understood that. Understood it so completely that she didn't say anything else about it, just nodded once in the way that meant, "I know exactly what you mean, and you don't have to explain further." Mesilla was a small town that didn't waste energy on impressiveness. It existed because the road needed it to exist, a place to resupply rest horses, sleep in an actual bed if you had the money and the inclination. Thomas had the money. The inclination he was less sure about because stopping meant being findable, and findable was a condition he'd been working against for 2 days. But Copper needed a proper rest. And they both needed to eat something that wasn't salt beef and dried beans, and Diego's contact, a man named Hector Ruiz, who ran a freight yard on the west end of town, was worth finding. Hector turned out to be a barrel-shaped man in his 40s, with a handshake that could have bent iron and an immediate direct quality that Thomas respected on contact. He read Diego's note, looked at both of them, with the evaluating eyes of a man who'd helped people in complicated situations before, and said, "You can sleep in the back room of the freight office. Nobody will know you're here." "We don't want to," Julia started. "Diego helped my brother's family get out of a situation in '82, Hector said, cutting her off cleanly and without rudeness. "I owe him more than a back room and a meal. Sit down." They sat down. Over food, real food, hot food, the kind that Maria Martinez had also understood was its own form of medicine, Hector told them what he'd heard. "There's a man been asking up and down this road," he said, "offering $50 for information about a woman traveling west." He looked at Julia without drama. $50 is a lot of money to a lot of people out here." "Has anyone taken it?" Thomas asked. "Not from anyone I know of, not yet." Hector's voice had a careful emphasis on those last 2 words. "But the man doing the asking, he's not the kind who gets told no for long. He's got money and he's got anger, and that combination moves things eventually." "Samuel," Julia said quietly, almost to herself. "He's got a name?" Hector asked. "Samuel Kendrick. He is my ex-husband." She said it with the particular clarity of someone who'd practiced stating the hardest true things until they stopped having the power to knock her sideways. "The divorce is legal, properly filed and registered. He doesn't accept it." Hector looked at her for a long moment with an expression that contained several things: recognition, something like anger on her behalf, and the deliberate settling of a decision. "There's a U.S. Marshal who comes through Mesilla every 3 weeks," he said. "His name is Aldridge. He's an honest man, genuinely, not just legally. He was here 6 days ago, so he won't be back for another 2.5 weeks." He paused. "But there's a territorial court judge in Santa Fe who would hear this case if you could get the documentation in front of him. A man named Carver. He has no patience for men who use money to override legal rulings." Julia leaned forward slightly. "You know a lot about the legal landscape." "I move freight across 4 territories," Hector said. "You learn who has power and how they use it. It's survival information." He looked between them. "The documentation you have, the divorce decree, the registration. Where is it?" Julia reached into the inner pocket of her coat and produced a folded set of papers that had been folded and unfolded enough times that the creases were wearing soft. She laid them on the table. Hector looked them over with more than casual attention. He turned them red key sections, held one page to the light. Then he set them down and said, "These are solid. Anyone with legal standing who looks at these has no legitimate basis to touch you." He paused. "The problem is that Samuel Kendrick isn't using legal standing. He's using money and men." "I know," Julia said. "The answer to money and men," Hector said, "is getting somewhere that money and men can't operate without scrutiny. A city, federal presence, witnesses." He looked at Thomas. "How fast can you move?" "Fast enough," Thomas said.
Ciao.
They left Mesilla before dawn, with resupplied provisions. Fresh water and a name and address in Santa Fe, written on a piece of paper in Hector's careful handwriting. The detour to Santa Fe would add time to the journey, but Hector had been direct. Getting the documentation registered with a federal territorial court would mean that Samuel's pursuit crossed a line from domestic dispute, which law enforcement often found reasons to stay out of, into federal obstruction of a legal court order, which was an entirely different category of serious. Thomas explained this to Julia as they rode out, and she listened with the focused attention she brought to anything operational. "It makes sense," she said when he finished. "Samuel's been operating in the gap between what's technically legal and what's actually being enforced. A federal registration closes that gap." "That's exactly it." "He'll know what it means too," she said. "If he has any informants in that circuit, and he might, he'll know we went to Santa Fe, and he'll know why. Which means we need to move before he can intercept." "How far is Santa Fe from here?" 2 days hard riding, maybe a day and a half if we push." She didn't hesitate. "We push." They were 6 hours out of Mesilla and making good time when Thomas saw the riders. Not behind them this time. Ahead. 3 men on the road, stopped, positioned in a way that was not accidental. The middle road, both edges, no clean way around without leaving the track entirely and hitting ground that would slow them badly. Thomas pulled Copper to a stop. Julia was already reaching under her coat. "How do you want to do this?" she said. "Let me see if they'll talk first. And if they won't, then we'll know that." He walked Copper forward at a measured pace. The 3 men watched them come. 2 had the look of hired work, competent professional, not particularly invested in the outcome beyond their fee. The third was different. The third was Samuel Kendrick. Thomas knew it before he'd gotten close enough to make out features. He knew it from the way Julia's breathing changed behind him, a single sharp intake, and then controlled stillness, the kind of stillness that takes real effort. Samuel Kendrick was a well-built man in his late 30s with the particular good looks that come with money and confirmed themselves over time into something harder and more angular. He was dressed better than the road warranted. He sat his horse with the ease of someone who expected arrangements to accommodate themselves to him, not the other way around. "Julia," he said, and his voice had a quality to it, warm on the surface, something else entirely underneath, like a board over a drop. "Samuel," she said from behind Thomas. Her voice was completely even. "I've been looking for you," Samuel said. "I know." Come home. We can discuss the rest." He said it with a reasonableness that must have sounded, Thomas thought, genuinely reasonable to people who didn't know what it was covering. "Whatever happened between us, whatever you think happened, it's out. There's nothing to work out," Julia said. "The marriage is legally dissolved. The decree is registered. Whatever you think you're doing out here, it's not legal, and you know it." Something moved across Samuel's face, fast controlled, but there. "The decree," he said, "was obtained under fraudulent circumstances. My lawyers are already filing to have it overturned." Julia's voice didn't waver. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that you were not mentally competent to enter into legal proceedings," Samuel said. And there it was, the same weapon he'd tried once before, sharpened and brought back out. "I have 2 physicians prepared to testify." "You have 2 physicians you paid," Julia said. "Julia, you tried this before," she said. And now there was something in her voice that wasn't fear or anger, but something colder and more precise. "Judge Orton ruled against you. The panel in Waco ruled against you. You have lost this legally 3 times, Samuel, and each time you just find a new mechanism." She paused. "I am not coming back. Not today. Not ever. And the documentation I'm carrying is going to be registered with the territorial court in Santa Fe before this week is out, which means the next time you send men after me, it won't be a domestic matter. It will be a federal one." The reasonableness drained out of Samuel's face. What was underneath it was not pretty. He looked at Thomas for the first time, really looked at him with the evaluating eyes of a man pricing something. "Who are you?" he said. "Thomas Brighton." Thomas kept his voice level. "Nobody of particular consequence to you." "You're traveling with my wife." "Your ex-wife," Thomas said. "The paperwork's in her coat and it's real. You know it's real." "The paperwork is being contested." "Contested paperwork is still valid paperwork until a court rules otherwise," Thomas said. "And the court hasn't ruled otherwise, which means right now today on this road she is a free woman who is choosing not to go with you. And you blocking this road constitutes something that a federal judge would have opinions about." Samuel's jaw tightened. His 2 hired men were watching the exchange with the focused non-expression of professionals calculating scenarios. "Move aside," Thomas said. "Not loud, not aggressive, just clear." "Or what?" Samuel said. Thomas looked at him steadily. "Or this conversation ends in a way that's worse for everybody, and you've still lost, and the territorial court in Santa Fe gets a report about this specific road on this specific day with 3 witnesses and a physical description." He paused. "I've met men like you before. You're used to having the money and having the leverage and having the last word. But you're standing on the wrong side of a legal ruling in front of a man who has nothing to lose, and a woman who's been building toward this moment for 3 years. Think carefully." The silence stretched. One of the hired men shifted in his saddle, said quietly to the other, "He's right about the federal angle." Samuel shot him a look that could have stripped paint. The man didn't bother looking apologetic. He was a professional. Federal complications were above his pay grade, and both of them knew it. For one long suspended moment, Thomas genuinely didn't know which way it was going to go. Samuel had the look of a man who'd gone too far and too long, and spent too much to back down cleanly, and that made him more dangerous than the hired men, not less. Desperate pride in a man with resources was a volatile combination. Then Samuel's hand moved toward his belt. Thomas drew and fired in one motion, not at Samuel, but at the ground directly in front of Samuel's horse. The animal lurched sideways, and Samuel grabbed for the reins, and the 2 professionals pulled their own horses back, and the moment that had been gathering itself toward something irreversible broke apart into noise and dust and motion. "Next one isn't a warning," Thomas said. His voice had not changed at all. Samuel got his horse under control. His face was white with fury, the specific fury of a man who has been publicly made to flinch. His hands were shaking, though Thomas wasn't sure Samuel knew it. "This isn't finished," Samuel said. "It will be," Thomas said. "When Julia decides it is." Samuel looked at her then. One last time. And what Thomas saw on his face, just for a second, stripped of the performance and the money and the machinery of control, was something that might have been loss. Not love. Samuel Kendrick didn't know what love was in any form Thomas recognized. But loss, the loss of a thing he'd owned and could no longer locate, that was real. Julia looked back at him and said nothing. That nothing was its own complete sentence. Samuel turned his horse. The two hired men went with him without a word, and Thomas watched them go east back the direction they'd come and didn't turn away until they'd cleared a quarter mile. Then he felt Julia's hand on his arm. She'd moved Copper up beside him. He looked at her. Her face was doing something complicated, a dozen things at once, controlled, but not suppressed, present, but not falling apart. She was shaking. Not visibly, he could just feel it through the point of contact at his arm. "Are you all right?" he said. "I will be," she said. Then, "That was the first time I've ever looked at him and not been afraid." Thomas held that. "What were you instead?" he asked. She thought about it for a moment. "Done," she said. "I was just done." He covered her hand on his arm briefly with his own, not a grand gesture, not charged with anything that needed naming. Just contact. Just two people on a road who'd come through something together and were still standing. "Santa Fe," he said. "Santa Fe," she agreed. They made Santa Fe in 37 hours of hard riding, with one brief stop, and the territorial court clerk, a thin, precise man named Oakes, who looked like he'd been made specifically for the purpose of processing documents, correctly examined Julia's papers with the careful attention of someone who understood that paper was power and power had to be handled accurately. He stamped them, registered them, gave Julia a certified copy with the territorial court seal. "This is now a matter of federal record," he said. "Any interference with this individual constitutes obstruction of a territorial court order. The penalties are significant." Julia held the certified copy and looked at it for a long moment. Thomas watched her. He watched the thing happen on her face, not dramatic, not a collapse, not a performance of relief. Just a quiet settling, like a building that had been braced for impact, finally getting to stand normally under its own weight. 3 years, she said quietly. "It's done," Thomas said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, just with something alive and present and forward-facing. "It's done," she said, like she was learning the shape of those words and finding they fit. They walked out of the territorial court into the afternoon, and the certified copy was in Julia's coat against her heart, and the road west was still ahead of them, with all its miles and difficulties and unknowns. But the ground had shifted. Samuel Kendrick could still come. He probably would. Men like Samuel didn't stop because the legal mechanism failed. They found other mechanisms, or they abandoned cleverness and became simply dangerous. Thomas knew that. Julia knew it better. But she was no longer running from a gap in the law. She was running toward a life. That was a different kind of running altogether. That night they camped outside Santa Fe, and the fire was small, and the sky was enormous overhead. And they ate in comfortable silence for a while before Julia said, "Why didn't you just ride past me that morning?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I don't know," he said. "I've been asking myself that. And I think—" He paused. "I think I'd been riding toward something for so long that I'd forgotten there was also the possibility of riding toward someone." He let that sit. "That sounds—" "No," she said. "It doesn't." She was looking at the fire. "I spent 3 years planning how to get free. I never once planned what free would look like once I had it. I just knew I needed to get there." She paused. "And now I'm sitting here, and I have a piece of paper that says I'm legally myself again, and California is still a couple weeks ahead of me, and there's a man next to me who fired a warning shot to protect my right to leave." She almost smiled. "Life is strange." "It is," Thomas agreed. "Thomas." "Yeah. I'm glad you didn't ride past." He looked at her across the small fire. "So am I," he said. The fire burned down. The stars did their patient work overhead. And somewhere behind them, Samuel Kendrick was recalculating, regrouping, looking for the next mechanism. And somewhere ahead, California was waiting. And Thomas Brighton, who had left Texas alone with a plan that was half a hope, sat beside a woman who had rebuilt herself from wreckage and was still building, and the distance between where they were and where they were going felt for the first time like something they were going to cover. They left Santa Fe with the certified copy and a half-day's head start on whatever Samuel was planning next. Thomas didn't let himself believe the road confrontation had ended anything. He'd watched Samuel's face when he turned that horse around, and what he'd seen there wasn't defeat, it was recalculation. Men with Samuel's particular combination of money and wounded pride didn't stop. They regrouped. They found the angle that still worked, and they came back through it. The federal registration made Julia legally safer, but it didn't make her physically safer, and Thomas knew the difference between those two things better than he wanted to. So he rode with his eyes moving, and his rifle accessible, and his mind working the problem the same way he'd work a difficult stretch of terrain. Not panicking, not pretending it wasn't there, just accounting for it steadily, and staying a step ahead. Julia rode with the same alertness. They'd stopped explaining it to each other. They just both did it now, covering different angles without discussion the way people do when they've been in enough tight situations together that the coordination becomes instinctive. 4 days out of Santa Fe, the land changed under them harder, more spare, the kind of country that didn't negotiate with the people crossing it. The heat was serious. The water sources on Thomas's map were spaced with uncomfortable optimism, and twice they arrived at a marked location to find it dry or fouled. "Your map," Julia said on the second occasion, looking at the ruined water source with an expression of resigned assessment, "was made by someone who hadn't been here in a while." "I'm beginning to suspect that," Thomas said. "How much water do we have?" "Enough for today if we're careful. Tomorrow gets tight." He looked at the sky, calculating. "There's a settlement about 18 miles west. Not on the map, but a freighter in Santa Fe mentioned it. Ranchers, a few families. If it's real, it has water." "If it's real," she repeated. "Most things people mention turn out to be real enough," he said. "They're just sometimes smaller or different than described." "That," she said, "is the most optimistic framing of uncertainty I've ever heard." He almost smiled. They rationed carefully and rode steady, and the settlement turned out to be real 6 structures and a well, and a woman named Patrice, who ran what she called a supply stop out of her front room, and looked at them with the unsentimental practicality of someone who'd seen every kind of traveler the road produced. "You're being followed," Patrice said, not as a question while she filled their canteens. Thomas looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "Man came through here yesterday asking about a couple heading west. Woman matching your description." She nodded at Julia, gave a name, said she was his wife and she'd been taken. Julia's jaw tightened. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I hadn't seen anybody matching that description." Patrice said it flatly, like it wasn't worth elaborating on. He was the kind of man who makes that decision easy. "Thank you," Julia said. "Don't thank me. Buy your provisions and keep moving." She paused. He had one man with him this time. Not the group I heard he'd been traveling with. Just one. She looked at Thomas. Either the others went a different direction, or he sent them ahead. Either way, he's close. Thomas and Julia exchanged a look. "One man," Thomas said. "The one man concerns me more than the group," Julia said quietly. "Samuel traveling with one person means he's not planning a confrontation. He's planning something else." "Like what?" She thought for a moment, and he could see her turning through Samuel's logic, the way you navigate a building you know well, but don't want to be in. "Samuel doesn't like to lose publicly," she said. "The road confrontation, you made him back down in front of his hired men. That cost him something he doesn't forgive." She paused. "When Samuel stops coming at a problem directly, it means he's found a different door." They found the different door that same evening. They'd made another 9 miles and stopped at a shallow creek to water copper and rest during the worst of the late heat, when Thomas noticed the man. He was sitting on a rock about 50 yards downstream. Not doing anything in particular, in the particular way of someone who is very carefully doing nothing in particular so as not to attract attention. He had the look of a professional, not hired muscle, something more specific. a man of papers and processes rather than fists. Thomas watched him without appearing to. The man stood eventually and walked toward them with the careful, open-handed approach of someone who wanted to be perceived as non-threatening. "Afternoon," he said. He had a document case under his arm. "Afternoon," Thomas said. "I'm looking for a Julia Kendrick." He looked at Julia with a professional blankness that was its own kind of answer. "I believe that's you, ma'am." "Who are you?" Thomas said. "My name is Caswell. I'm a process server employed by the legal firm of Mather and Dodd out of Waco, Texas." He opened the document case and produced a folded set of papers. "I have a court filing here. A petition for involuntary commitment signed by 2 physicians and 1 family member filed in the court of Waco County, requesting that Julia Ann Kendrick be remanded to the Waco County Asylum for the infirm pending psychiatric evaluation." The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. Then Julia said very quietly, "He actually did it." "The petition was filed 4 days ago," Caswell said with the careful neutrality of a man who delivered bad news for a living and had learned to keep his own face out of it. "I'm required to serve you personally with notification of the filing and the date of the hearing." He held the papers out. Julia didn't take them immediately. She stood very still, and Thomas could feel the thing that was happening inside her, not collapse, not panic, but the specific impact of something you'd feared and prepared for, and still weren't ready for when it actually landed. Thomas said, "What court? What judge?" "Waco County Circuit, Judge Moreland." "Not Judge Orton." Caswell's neutral expression shifted fractionally. "Judge Orton recused himself from Kendrick matters following the divorce ruling. Judge Moreland is newly appointed." He paused. "He was appointed 3 months ago." Thomas looked at Julia. She looked back at him, and he could see her working through exactly what he was working through a newly appointed judge. A court Samuel had never lost in a petition filed the day after the Santa Fe confrontation. "The hearing date," Julia said. 3 weeks from yesterday." "We're in New Mexico territory," Thomas said. "The Waco County Court has no jurisdiction to compel her presence." "The petition is for a hearing," Caswell said carefully. "Non-appearance creates a default. Default allows the court to rule in absentia." He was being more helpful than his role technically required, Thomas noticed. However, a registered response through counsel or a counterfiling through a court of equal standing would stay the default. Julia took the papers. She unfolded them slowly and read them with the focused attention of someone who had learned to treat their enemy's moves as information rather than devastation. Thomas watched her face as she read. It was still but working. "2 physicians," she said, "Dr. Harmon and Dr. Price." She looked up. "Harmon treated me twice during the marriage, both times for injuries Samuel caused. He filed the reports as household accidents." Her voice was precise and cold. "He's been in Samuel's pocket since 1882. "And Price?" "I've never seen a Dr. Price in my life." She folded the papers back carefully. "Samuel manufactured him." "Can you prove that?" "I can if I can get my own physician's records from the doctor I saw in Austin after I left. Dr. Margaret Calloway. She examined me, documented everything, kept copies." She looked at Thomas. "She told me to keep a copy of her report. I have it." She tapped the inner pocket of her coat. "I have everything." Thomas turned back to Caswell. "Is there a telegraph office in the next settlement west?" 40 miles. Town called Red Rock. What's the fastest way to get a counterfiling before a territorial court that could stay this default?" Caswell was quiet for a moment. He was clearly deciding how much of his personal opinion his professional role allowed him to express. Then he said, "I'm going to tell you something that isn't in the papers I served you. The federal court in Albuquerque has appellate standing over Waco County in matters involving individuals currently located in the territory. If you telegraph a filing from Red Rock to the Albuquerque court before that Waco County hearing date, and if your documentation is as solid as it appears to be, the federal court can issue a stay that supersedes the Waco default." He paused. That's a legal opinion I'm giving you as a private citizen, not as a process server. Make of it what you will." He closed his document case. "Good luck, ma'am," he said to Julia. He walked back to his horse and rode away. Julia stood holding the commitment petition, and Thomas stood beside, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Julia said, "He found the other door." "He did," Thomas said, "but Caswell just handed us the key to it." They pushed hard for Red Rock. 40 miles was a day and a half at good pace, and they made it in just over a day, riding into the small but functional town in the late afternoon of the following day, with tired horses, and a plan that had been built and refined and stress-tested in conversation during every mile of the journey. The telegraph office was run by a young man named Pike, who took his responsibility with an admirable seriousness, and who did not ask unnecessary questions about the legal documents Thomas and Julia had him transcribe into a telegraph message addressed to the clerk of the federal court in Albuquerque. The message was long. It cost more than Thomas wanted to spend. He spent it without hesitation. "Confirmation," Pike asked. "How long?" "Day, maybe 2. I'll send word to wherever you're staying." Thomas looked at Julia. She was looking at the telegraph machine with an expression he'd seen once before in Santa Fe when the clerk had stamped her papers. A controlled forward-facing focus that was the way Julia Kendrick handled hope. Not letting it get big, not letting it run, but not suppressing it either. Holding it carefully, like something that needed to be carried correctly. "We'll be at the hotel," Thomas said. "Katipu." The hotel in Red Rock had 4 rooms and a proprietor named Weston, who was laconic in the way of men who'd seen too much passing through to find any of it surprising. He gave them 2 rooms without comment. Julia stopped at her door and looked at Thomas across the narrow hallway. "Thank you," she said. "For what specifically?" "For not treating this like my problem that you're helping with," she said. "You've been treating it like our problem that we're solving. That's..." She paused. "That's not something I've had before." Thomas looked at her for a moment. "You've been carrying this alone for 3 years," he said. "Longer," she said quietly. "Well," he said, "you're not carrying it alone anymore." He said it simply, without ceremony, just the fact of it. She held his gaze for a moment that lasted a beat longer than practical communication required. "Good night, Thomas," she said. "Good night, Julia." The telegram confirmation came the following afternoon. The federal court of Albuquerque had received the filing. A duty judge had reviewed the documentation. A stay of the Waco County default had been issued effective immediately, pending a full federal review of the commitment petition. The Waco County Court was notified. Pike handed Thomas the confirmation slip with the solemnity of a man who understood, even without the details, that this was significant. Thomas walked outside to where Julia was waiting. He held the slip out. She read it. Read it again. Then she sat down on the bench outside the telegraph office and put her face in her hands, and her shoulders shook once, just once, and then she was still. Thomas sat down next to her. He didn't say anything. After a moment she lifted her face and it was composed again, but her eyes were wet and she didn't try to hide it. "I want to open a restaurant," she said. Her voice was slightly unsteady. "I want to feed people, and have a place that's mine, and wake up somewhere nobody is looking for me." She stopped. "I want a life." "You're going to have one," Thomas said. "You don't know that." "No," he said, "but I know who you are, and people like you make the things they're going toward happen." He paused. "You've outmaneuvered him at every turn. You've built legal protection from nothing but your own preparation. You went to Santa Fe when you were exhausted and scared, and you got it registered. And today, a federal court told Samuel Kendrick that his mechanism failed." He looked at her. "That didn't happen to you. You made that happen." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand in one clean motion. "I had help," she said. "You had someone riding beside you," Thomas said. "The work was yours." She looked at him with an expression that was open in a way he hadn't seen from her before, not performing composure, not calculating, just present. "When we get to California," she said. What happens? The question sat in the air between them, and it was not a simple question. What do you want to happen? He said. She was quiet for a moment. I want to figure out who I am when nobody is chasing me, she said. I've been Julia Kendrick who is running. I don't know yet who Julia Kendrick is when she stops. She paused. I want to find out. Thomas nodded. That was honest. It was right. Then that's what happens, he said. You find out. He paused, and then carefully. I'd like to be around while you do, if that's something you'd be open to. She looked at him for a long moment. Ask me again in California, she said. When I'm standing still. Fair enough, he said. They left Red Rock the next morning with the confirmation in Julia's coat, alongside the divorce decree, and Dr. Calloway's medical report, and the certified territorial registration. 4 documents, each one a wall she'd built between herself and the thing that had been trying to close in on her for 3 years. Thomas thought about that as they wrote about the architecture of escape, about how much of Julia's survival had been built, not from running, but from building. Building evidence, building legal standing, building the paper record that made her harder to erase. She wasn't just tough, she was methodical. And methodical under pressure was the kind of quality Thomas had rarely seen and deeply respected. They'd been riding 4 hours when he heard a sound behind them that was the wrong rhythm, too deliberate. He didn't react visibly, just shifted slightly. Don't turn around, he said quietly. One rider, Julia said, just as quietly. About a quarter mile. Has been there for 20 minutes. I know. Single rider following at a maintained distance, she said. Not gaining, not falling back. He's tracking, not closing, Thomas said. Waiting for something. For us to stop. Or for someone ahead to get in position. Julia was quiet for a moment. Samuel's not on that horse. He rides differently. She paused. It's the professional, the one Patrice mentioned. Thomas thought through the geometry of it. Single professional behind them, the road narrowing ahead, Samuel somewhere. How far to the next settlement? Julia asked. 20 miles. Too far to run for? Yeah. Then we handle it here, she said. Not a question. Thomas looked at the road ahead, a long flat stretch with a curve about a mile out. He made his decision. When we reach that curve, he said, we stop. Not like we noticed him, like we're checking the horse. And then we see who he is and what he actually wants. He paused. If Samuel is ahead of us, this man behind us is meant to push us forward, which means we don't go forward. We turn around and face him. We turn around and face him. Thomas confirmed. Julia reached under her coat. The revolver was in her hand, not raised, just present. When you're ready, she said. Thomas Brighton, who had left Texas alone with a plan that was always thinner than it looked, reached the curve in the road and stopped his horse and turned around to face whatever was coming. He was not alone, and somehow, against everything reasonable, that made the difference. The man who rode toward them was not what Thomas expected. He was older, late 50s, maybe 60, with the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone who had decided a long time ago that urgency was mostly a waste of energy. He stopped his horse about 20 yards out and held both hands away from his body in the open gesture of someone who understood exactly how this moment read and wanted to address it directly. My name is Aldridge, he said, U.S. Marshal. I'd appreciate it if the lady would point that revolver somewhere other than my chest. Julia didn't lower it immediately. Identification, she said. He reached slowly into his coat and produced a badge and a folded paper and held them out. Thomas rode forward and took them, examined them, handed them back. Marshal Aldridge, Thomas said. Hector Ruiz in Mesilla mentioned your name. Something shifted in the man's face, a slight easing. Hector telegraphed me 4 days ago, told me the situation. I've been moving to intercept since. He looked at Julia. You can put it down, ma'am. I'm not here for anything except to tell you what's happening behind you. Julia lowered the revolver slowly. Her eyes stayed on him. Samuel Kendrick. Aldridge said, crossed a federal line 2 days ago. He attempted to bribe a clerk at the Albuquerque Federal Court to delay processing your stay filing. The clerk reported it. That is now a federal offense: obstruction of court process, attempted bribery of a federal official. He paused. I have a warrant for his arrest. The silence that followed was the particular silence of something enormous, landing so quietly you weren't sure at first if you'd heard correctly. Julia said, "Say that again." "I have a federal warrant for Samuel Kendrick's arrest," Aldridge repeated. "He's been trying to find you to force a resolution before the warrant caught up with him. He knows it's coming." The marshal looked at her steadily. "He's behind you, ma'am. About 6 hours back. He's alone now. The hired men left when the federal warrant became known. Professional men don't take federal exposure for a domestic dispute." He paused. "I need you two to stay on this road and let him come to me." Thomas looked at Julia. Her face was doing that thing again, holding too many things at once, processing fast, staying upright through it. But there was something new in it this time. Something that looked cautiously and almost disbelievingly like the end of something. "He's actually going to be arrested," she said. Not to Aldridge, to herself. "If he comes down this road, yes," Aldridge said. "And he will. He doesn't have anywhere else to go at Minute." They waited. Thomas had waited in difficult situations before, had waited out weather, waited out standoffs, waited in the particular suspended tension of not knowing which way something was going to break. But this waiting had a different quality. This was waiting for a door to close permanently on something that had been open and threatening for 3 years of Julia Kendrick's life. That kind of waiting had a weight to it that ordinary waiting didn't. Julia sat on a rock off the road and held the confirmation slip from the Albuquerque court and didn't speak. Thomas sat near her and didn't speak either. Aldridge positioned himself and his horse with a professional patience. 40 minutes passed. Then Julia said quietly, "He used to tell me I was imagining things. When I tried to describe what was happening to people, friends, family, he was so reasonable in public, so considered that nobody believed the private version. I started to wonder sometimes if I was the one who was wrong." She paused. "That's the part that took the longest to recover from, not the fear, the doubt." Thomas looked at her. "You weren't wrong," he said. "I know that now." She looked at the confirmation slip. "It took a federal court and a marshal and 3 years of building a paper record, but I know it now." "You knew it before any of that," Thomas said. "You knew it the day you packed one bag and walked out. You just had to get enough distance to hear yourself clearly." She looked at him with that open expression, the one that had no calculation in it, that was just her present and unguarded. "You're a good man, Thomas Brighton," she said. "I'm a reasonably decent one," he said. "There's a difference." The ghost of a real smile crossed her face, not the contained near smile he'd seen before, but something fuller, something that reached her eyes. Then Aldridge said from his position on the road, "Here he comes." Samuel Kendrick rode into the situation with the bearing of a man who still believed against all available evidence that he was going to control the outcome. He pulled up short when he saw Aldridge and Thomas watch the calculation happen on his face, the rapid inventory of the scene. The assessment of options, the moment when a man who'd spent years finding mechanisms realizes he's run out of them. "Samuel Kendrick," Aldridge said. His voice had the flat carrying authority of someone who said names in professional contexts regularly and had long since removed any drama from the act. "I have a federal warrant for your arrest. Obstruction of federal court process and attempted bribery of a federal official. Get down from the horse." Samuel's eyes moved to Julia. Whatever he was looking for in her face, he didn't find it. She looked back at him with the same nothing she'd given him on the road in New Mexico, complete, finished a door that was not going to open. "This is a misunderstanding," Samuel said, and his voice had the smooth surface of a man who'd talked his way out of things before. "The clerk in Albuquerque misrepresented what was—" "The clerk filed a sworn affidavit," Aldridge said. "Get down from the horse." "I have lawyers. You're welcome to contact them from federal custody," Aldridge said. Get down from the horse, Mr. Kendrick. I won't ask again. Samuel looked at Thomas. And what Thomas saw in his face in that moment was not the anger he'd seen before, not the white fury of the road confrontation. It was something smaller and uglier, the expression of a man who had genuinely never believed this specific outcome was possible, because men like him moved through the world with a fundamental expectation that consequences were for other people. He got down from the horse. Aldridge was efficient and professional about the rest of it. Samuel said several more things during the process in several different registers, reasonable then cold, then something approaching threatening, and Aldridge responded to none of them except to say once, "You'll have opportunity to speak to that at your hearing." Julia watched the whole thing from where she stood off the road. Thomas stood near her, but not between her and the scene. He understood, without it being said, that she needed to see this directly. Not protected from it. Not filtered. When it was done, and Samuel was secured, and Aldridge had his horse in hand, the marshal looked at Julia. "You'll need to provide testimony at the federal hearing," he said. "That can be done in writing with notarization filed through any federal court office. Given the documentation you apparently have, it should be straightforward." He paused. "I'm sorry it took this long, ma'am." Julia held his gaze for a moment. "It took exactly as long as it took," she said. "Thank you, Marshal." Aldridge nodded once, the nod of a man who'd done the right thing and didn't need to make more of it than that, and rode east with Samuel Kendrick, and the sound of their horses faded and the road went quiet. Thomas and Julia stood in that quiet. She let out a breath. It was long and slow, and it seemed to carry something with it, not just air, but weight. The kind of weight you carry so long you stop noticing it until it's gone, and the absence of it is almost physical. Her eyes were bright again, not tears, something else. "It's over," she said. "It's over," Thomas confirmed. She turned and looked at the road west, the long road that still had miles in it, still had the Sierra Nevada and the valley approaches and all the difficulty that California didn't exempt people from just because they wanted it badly. "Let's go," she said. They crossed into California 11 days later. The crossing was not dramatic. There was no sign, no ceremony, no clear moment where the ground announced itself as something new. But Thomas felt it, a shift in the air, something that was partly climatic and partly something less physical, the particular sensation of arriving somewhere you've been holding in your mind so long that the reality of it takes a moment to reconcile with the idea. Julia felt it too. He knew because she went quiet in a specific way, not the alertness quiet of the journey, but something softer. She was taking it in. "California," she said. "California," he said. She took a breath of the air like it was something she wanted to remember. They reached the coastal town of San Benito, 40 miles south of San Francisco, 3 days after that. It was a working town with fishing boats and supply merchants and the particular energy of a place that was still becoming itself, still figuring out what it was going to be. There was noise and commerce and the smell of the ocean, which neither of them had smelled before, and it hit them both differently. Thomas stopped in front of a land office on the main street. Julia stopped beside him. "Go in," she said. "I'll be an hour." "I'll be here," she said. "I want to walk around." She paused. "I want to walk around somewhere nobody knows my name, and nobody is looking for me, and just see what that feels like." He looked at her. "How does it feel so far?" he asked. She considered it seriously. "Quiet," she said. "Extraordinarily quiet." She looked at him with something that was the furthest thing from the calculated assessment she'd turned on him that first morning on a Texas road. "Go buy your land, Thomas Brighton." He went in. The land agent's name was Collins, and he had the enthusiastic directness of a man who genuinely liked land and liked connecting people with it. He spread maps across his desk and talked about available parcels with the particular passion of a person discussing something they loved. The parcel he showed Thomas, 12 miles northeast of San Benito, 80 acres, with a good water source and south-facing slopes, and a small existing structure, was more than Thomas had in cash, but less than Thomas had in cash, and the letter of credit that Elias Foran had sent in response to Thomas's telegraph from Santa Fe. Elias, it turned out, was a man who moved faster than expected. His response to Thomas's message, which had been simple and direct, explaining his situation and his timeline, had been simple. The parcel near Sacramento was still available. The installment terms were still good. And also, if Thomas found something on the coast, first, Elias would back him on letter of credit because he was 81 years old and had no one to leave his money to, and he'd rather see it work. Thomas had read that telegram in Santa Fe and felt something complicated and unfamiliar, the sensation of being helped without manipulation attached to it. He signed the papers on the coastal parcel with a hand that was steadier than he expected. When he walked out, Julia was sitting on the bench outside with her boots slightly dusty and an expression on her face that he hadn't seen there before. "I found it," she said. "Found what?" "The building." She stood up. "There's a building 2 streets over, ground floor. Previous tenant was a dry goods store. Owner wants to sell or lease either one. It's the right size, it's got a back room that would work as a kitchen, and it's on the street where the fishing boats unload." She looked at him with clear, direct eyes. "The fishermen come off those boats in the morning and they're hungry, and they want something that tastes like someone thought about them. I know how to give them that." Thomas looked at her. She was different standing here than she'd been on a Texas road 11 weeks ago. Not more composed, she'd always been composed. But something had opened up in her. She stood differently, like someone who'd remembered the full dimensions of herself and was now occupying all of them. "How much does the owner want?" Thomas asked. She told him. He did the arithmetic. Between what he had left after the land purchase and what Julia had, the 8 months of carefully hoarded household money, less what the journey had cost, they were close. Not there, but close. "Hector Ruiz knows freight people up and down this coast," Thomas said. "If you needed a small loan at fair terms to cover the gap—" "I'm not taking a loan," Julia said. "Not from anyone." She paused. "Not yet." She looked at the building again. "I'll negotiate the lease first. Start with what I have, build the capital, buy it outright when I can." "That's the harder path," Thomas said. "I know every path I walk," she said simply. "I need to walk the ones I choose." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "I just wanted you to know the option existed." She nodded. Then she looked at him with the directness that was he'd come to understand her most fundamental quality. Not armor, just honesty. "You said in Red Rock to ask you again in California," she said, "when I was standing still." He had said that. She had said to ask her again in California when she was standing still. "You're standing still," he said. "I am. Then I'm asking." He held her gaze. "I'd like to build something here. The ranch of life, whatever comes after the hard part." He paused. "I'd like to build it with you." Julia was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, processing the way she processed everything fully and honestly without rushing to an answer that wasn't ready yet. "I spent 3 years planning how to get free," she said. "And all of that time the thing I was planning toward was mine. Just mine. I couldn't afford to plan toward anything else." She paused. "I don't entirely know how to plan toward something that belongs to 2 people." "Neither do I," Thomas said. "I've never done it either." "That should probably concern us both," she said. "Probably," he agreed. Something crossed her face, and then she laughed. A real one, short and unguarded, the kind that arrives before you decide to let it. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. It sounded like the person she was when nobody was chasing her. "Ask me properly," she said. "Julia Kendrick," he said. "Will you build a life with me?" She looked at him. Looked at him the way she'd looked at that first water source that turned out to be real, that first piece of news that turned out to be true, with the careful wondering of someone who'd learned to want things cautiously because wanting had been expensive. "Yes," she said, "but we do it as equals." "I wouldn't know what to do with anything else," he said. She put her hand out the same way she had that first morning, businesslike, direct, sealing something real. He took it. They were married in San Benito 6 weeks later in the office of a justice of the peace named Hobart, who conducted the ceremony with a brevity that suited them both. Miriam came down from San Francisco, Julia's cousin, the one who had sent money for the divorce lawyer, who had written coded letters about flower gardens, who had been keeping a light on from 3,000 miles away for 2 years. She cried through the whole ceremony without apology. Thomas did not cry. He stood next to Julia and held her hand and felt the particular solidity of a good decision, not the excited uncertainty of something gambled on, but the deep, quiet rightness of something earned. The ranch had a name within a month Brighton land. 80 acres, a rebuilt structure, copper in the paddock, and the particular piece of ground that belonged to you, that you had bought with your own work and your own money and your own decision. Julia's restaurant opened on a Tuesday in March with 12 tables and a menu written in her own hand and fishermen coming in off the boats at dawn wanting something that tasted like someone cared. She gave them that. She gave them that every morning for years. She hired 2 women from town who needed work. She trained them the way her grandmother had trained her, not giving orders, but sharing knowledge the way you share something precious. Within a year, the restaurant was full at every meal. Within 2 years, she bought the building outright. Thomas watched her do it. He watched the person she became when nobody was chasing her, and she was exactly who she'd told him she was going to be on that rock outside Santa Fe in the dark. She was herself. Fully, completely, without the shadow of Samuel Kendrick's version of her falling over anything. There were children, eventually. 2, a boy and a girl, both of whom grew up knowing that their parents had crossed a continent together before they were born, and had built everything they owned with their own hands, and had chosen each other freely without pressure or ownership, or anything except the clear-eyed recognition of 2 people who had seen each other at their most difficult, and decided that was exactly who they wanted beside them. The federal case against Samuel Kendrick concluded 18 months after his arrest. He was convicted on 3 counts and sentenced to 5 years. Richard never came west. The hired professionals had long since moved on to other employment. The Waco County commitment petition was formally dismissed by the court and expunged from record. Julia received the notification of dismissal on a Wednesday afternoon while the restaurant was between sittings. She read it once, folded it, and put it in her apron pocket. Then she went back to the kitchen. Thomas found out about it that evening when he came in from the ranch for dinner. The Waco petition was dismissed, she said, setting food on the table. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it genuinely, the way she thought about everything. Like it was a long time ago, she said. Like it happened to someone who was also me, but who lived in a different set of circumstances. She sat down. "I don't feel relieved exactly. I feel like a door that had already stopped mattering finally locked from the outside." She paused. "I feel like dinner is ready, and my husband is home and my children are asleep, and tomorrow morning the fishermen are going to come in cold and hungry, and I know exactly what I'm going to feed them." Thomas looked at her across the table. This woman who had stood in a road in Texas with a split lip and a canvas bag, and the look of someone calculating her odds who had carried her own legal armor for 3 years, and built her escape piece by piece from nothing, who had ridden across a continent beside him, and matched him mile for mile, and never once asked to be protected when what she needed was to be accompanied. "That," he said, "sounds exactly right." She looked at him with eyes that were clear and present and fully her own. "It does," she said. "Doesn't it?" They had not been saved by destiny. They had found each other on a road neither of them had planned to share, and they had chosen repeatedly and deliberately and with full knowledge of the cost to keep going in the same direction. And out of that choosing not fate, not luck, not divine arrangement, but the plain, stubborn human act of choosing, they had built a life that was entirely their own. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was everything.